Welcome to WTUFO. I hope you're enjoying watching or listening. If you'd like to support the show directly, you can do that at patreon.com/WTUFO, patreon.com/WTUFO. That will help increase the chances that the show continues to exist. If you're listening on a podcast player, you can also rate and review us. That'll help the algorithm know to tell other people about us. And likewise, if you're on YouTube, you can like and subscribe. And finally, if you're really digging it, you can post us on your favorite social or put us in a thread to your friends. Just kind of helping us spread the word, since we're a new show, is extremely useful and a valuable contribution to our mission. So thank you so much for engaging. I hope you enjoy the episode. Heads up about this one, it's pretty heady. This is a highly academic conversation. It's very theoretical and it's pretty abstract. So if you're into philosophical conversations, I think you might really enjoy it. It deals with frameworks of ideas and linguistic structures a lot. And if that's your thing, I think you're going to have a really good time with this. If you're out here more for like juicy UFO stories and nuts and bolts physics speculation, that would be a different episode. So if you do stick around, I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much for watching. What the UFO? I'm here with Michael Uhall. Michael, it's great to meet you.
Good to meet you as well, Caleb. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to talk to you. Michael is an author. He's an adjunct professor of political science at Indiana University and a civil servant, research administrator, and strategic planner at the University of Illinois. So as a starter, Michael, would you like to just tell us a little bit about your background, your training, and your interests?
So I'm a political theorist, and I did my doctoral work at the University of Illinois in the political science department. I actually started in the philosophy department there, and I got my master's degree in the mid-teens, and I transitioned over into political philosophy specifically, or what is called political theory in political science world, which is kind of a slightly different thing, but is basically a philosophical approach to politics and the background concepts that inform the whether it's political history or contemporary political institutions or whatever. I did my work specifically in environmental political theory, so I focused a lot on climate change and sort of the background conceptual stuff informing climate change, climate politics, climate dysfunction, the ecological crisis, things like this. I guess if I had to identify as something specifically, it would actually probably be as an intellectual historian, because the blend of studying philosophy on the one hand and political theory and history on the other hand has a lot to do with like trends of thought over time and how they inform political practice and outcomes.
Wow, that's really interesting. You were just telling me offline that you teach history of thought.
So at Indiana University, I teach ancient political philosophy and modern political thought. I also teach courses in American political thought. I introduce political theory largely through texts. Sometimes I teach international relations, focusing on international crises, war, political violence, and things of this nature. There's a really strong sort of through line through all of these things of emergent crises and what their intellectual backstory is and how conceptual material informs and propitiates or sometimes helps us try to navigate those crises in various ways. Crises don't come out of nowhere. They always have a backstory attached to them. And so a lot of the things I teach and my research programs have to do with this sort of thing.
This is fascinating, really high level work. I think we're going to have a really intriguing conversation. And I wanted to mention that you just told me that you are, in addition to being a political science writer, a fiction writer, and you are a published author of academic work as well. Like, for example, your first academic work, Noir Materialism, which I'm super curious about, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about if you would like to share it. I noticed one little meme idea just jumped out at me, although I haven't read this work, was this concept of the night side of nature and how it's something we maybe need to consider embracing more or exploring more deeply to confront the ecological challenges we're facing as a people. Would you like to explain that, unpack that, just because it's such a beautiful little piece of poetry, the night side of nature?
Sure. So actually just start with that turn of phrase. The night side of nature is a turn of phrase that comes out of a 19th century German thinker who I think has never really been translated. His name is Gotthold Schubert, and he was a philosopher of nature. He belonged to sort of a large and extended school of thought that was prominent in 19th century German philosophy and German culture called Naturphilosophie, or philosophers of nature, and they were interested in nature, like concepts of nature and what is possible in the natural world that is not entirely constrained by mechanistic philosophy specifically, right? I mean, the 19th century in Germany was, in a lot of ways, 19th century German philosophy in a lot of ways was defined by this contestation between the philosophers of nature on the one hand and the mechanistic philosophers on the other hand. And what was at stake in this contestation or in this dispute was a question about the function of nature and how we think about it. So the nature philosophers had this notion that nature functions organically, that it is not entirely defined by necessity and mechanistic function. And of course, the mechanists thought that it was. And so, in the final analysis, the mechanists won this particular dispute because there's a lot of instrumental gains that are achieved by thinking about nature in highly mechanistic kinds of ways. And, nature philosophy really went out of fashion by about 1860 or 1870 or so. So in any case, Schubert coins this turn of phrase, the night side of nature, to talk about strange and anomalous things in nature precisely. And for the 19th century Germans, this includes things like dreams. This is before the advent of psychoanalysis. So really the nature philosophers were very interested in dreams and dreaming and hypnosis and animal magnetism and actual magnetism and the ultraviolet spectrum, things like this. And this is sort of his catch-all term for strange things in nature that don't immediately obviously seem to be a function of material, mechanistic processes or effects that don't seem to fit very well into the mechanistic picture of what nature actually is. Dreams are actually a fantastic example here because it's quite strange. It's something that we all experience at one time or another, some very regularly and some infrequently, but we spend a lot of time sleeping and unconscious, and yet, images and feelings and thoughts and characters and dialogues and events and plots and strange, odd little things, banal and extraordinary, sort of flow through our heads almost every single night. It's quite experientially strange for sure, and I think it was perceived as both experientially strange then, but also something that's a really interesting natural function that is happening and that is doing something in the natural spaces. And so when Schubert is talking about the night side of nature, these are the kinds of things that he's pointing towards. Does that make sense?
Yeah, fascinating. And what made you interested in that area of research or thinking?
Well, so what made me interested in that area of research was an underlying concern about climate change. And as an intellectual historian and a political theorist, I was curious of what the conceptual history, not just of climate change itself, but of how it is that we think about nature and what is possible in nature. Arguably in Western philosophy, in the broadest possible sense, really, like from Plato or the pre-Socratic philosophers to the present, the status and definition of nature has a lot of priority, actually. It's a question about the world, is what is the world and what is nature, and what are we as natural or partly natural creatures? What is our relationship to the world around us? And so you have all of these conceptual accretions or developments historically that change the picture or the set of assumptions of what kinds of creatures we are and what it is possible or desirable or obligatory for us to do when we are comporting ourselves towards each other and towards the world that we're a part of. And in the early modern period, starting around 15 or 1600s, there's a increasingly novel picture of nature that starts to be developed by various philosophers and scientists. And this is tied up with the scientific revolution. This is tied up with various technological developments. To some extent, it's tied up with the early development of the Industrial Revolution. And the picture of nature that develops in the early modern period is one in which really, let's say, classical or traditional concepts like freedom and subjectivity don't fit very well, and they fit more and more badly as time goes on. And so this starts producing tensions about how it is possible to take free actions in a natural world that is entirely deterministic and mechanistic. For example, in the scientific revolution in the early modern period, there's this sensibility of nature as something that is deterministic, it's mechanistic. Things that happen and happen necessarily. You have a conceptual development of laws of nature as things that are entirely, there can be no exceptions to them. We are trying to determine exactly what those are. So it's a highly deterministic and mechanistic picture of the world. And what drops out of that picture are things like freedom, subjectivity, that fit into political interactions and questions about responsibility and obligation and normativity and things like this. And so you have this increasing tension in the early modern period up to the 19th century and the present about what happens to politics, what happens to moral philosophy, what happens to human freedom if the world is something that is entirely deterministic, that can be studied on the basis of conceptual assumptions about its necessitarianism, which means everything that happens naturally happens entirely necessarily. Everything has a cause, and through the methods of the natural sciences, we can determine what those causes are, map it out completely, and increase our instrumental control over producing certain kinds of consequences. This has been immensely fruitful. I mean, many, many games, technologically, industrially, and otherwise, are premised on this background sensibility of nature as a deterministic space. But the question remains, what about free action? What about moral obligations? What about freedom of choice? What about free will? These very classical philosophical kinds of questions. So kind of a long-winded way of saying, if we start to think about climate change in terms of conceptual blockages, like there's this tension between the very idea of politics as a space of free action on the one hand, and on the other hand, nature is an entirely deterministic space. So that's what I mean by the conceptual backstory of climate change here. It's not really about the idea of climate change and where it comes from or how people even became aware of environmental issues or something like this, as much as deep conceptual assumptions about what nature is and what we are as people who live in it, who live in the world. What is the world like, and what are we like as people who live there? I mean, these are really classical philosophical questions. And so that is kind of where the impetus for that project came from, and it cashed out in this book.
Recommend people pick it up or check it out. It's called Noir Materialism. Great title. And I think that might be a good time to start weaving in some UAP studies. What tipped you off into being interested in UAP studies? What started you down this road, and where are you now in that journey? A little bit early, still kind of finding your way in. I know you're working on a new book right now, and I gather this has kind of informed your thinking in some new ways in that direction. So I thought I'd just open the door.
So do you
gently
want
and generally?
Yeah.
What brought you to UAP studies?
Do you want like a long historical answer, or do you want like a shorter, snappier kind of answer?
Yes, let's start short and snappy, and then we'll spool as deeply as we feel.
The short and snappy version is that, I had some marginal interest in the subject, because of the 2017 New York Times article and things like this. And I just kind of vaguely kept an eye on it in a very loose, vague background sense of, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like, I wonder what's going to happen with this. And so years pass from 2017 to, I guess, 2022. And I happened to find myself watching the congressional hearing with David Grush, I think, as a number of people did. And I thought it was really striking. And I thought the nature of the allegations was really strong and strange and kind of polyvalent, like a lot of different stuff going on there to do with contestations over knowledge and contestation over claims. And you kind of have this thought or question of like, why is this being investigated by Congress? And also, why isn't it being talked about more broadly? What's going on here? And so I thought about this for a while, because if you take the kinds of allegations or prospective allegations that were being vocalized at that congressional hearing, and I think it was July 22, there seem to be a lot of potential implications, some of which have to do with UAP and some of which have to do with how institutional knowledge is created, like in our government and communicated to citizens of the country and things like this. And so it kind of bothered me, I guess, because I thought it was weird, which I think is a reasonable response. I thought it was strange. I thought it was weird. I thought it was interesting. And I thought about it for a while, and I thought about it for a while, and it seemed like there's sort of a stack of intersecting problems there. So I sort of wrote it up, and I contacted a couple of people who I did not know particularly well, or, professional associates, other faculty members, particularly in political theory. And I sent very tentative, careful emails to them to say, hey, like, did you happen to notice this? And it seems like XYZ issues and problems are attached to this. I can talk about what those are in a little bit if you want. Do you think there's anything here? Is there a there, and is there anything worth exploring here? And I was just kind of blown away by the basically unilateral support through, these sort of private back channels of personal correspondence yeah, it is very interesting. I don't know what to make of it, but it's definitely something that, warrants more attention. And it's strange that it doesn't get more attention because of reasons XYZ, ranging from an interest in UAP phenomenon itself to things to do with political institutions and public trust and social epistemology and the history of philosophy of science and just like a whole bunch of different things. So it really was kind of an experience of like finding an interesting box in your basement and sort of peeking into the top of the box and suddenly having like a whole bunch of jack-in-the-boxes just explode out of the box in your face, which might sound like a kind of unpleasant or horrifying experience, but I just found to be very energizing because it's like a wonderful surprise to bump into a corner of the world you haven't really spent that much time in and suddenly see all of its connectivity to all these other kinds of things and find out that there are lots of other people, or certainly more people than I thought, who are also interested in the subject or find it to be legitimately interesting, I guess is how you might put it. And since then, I mean, just apart from the substance of the work itself, it's been kind of a fantastic networking experience of just bumping into numerous people. I mean, I would say pretty much unilaterally, all of the people I've talked to about this in a significant or serious way, really intelligent, sophisticated, interesting engagements and perceptions of this whole complex of issues, which is extremely tall stack of intersecting things. So that's the short answer, I guess. I don't know if that's actually a short answer, but I'm an academic, so you'll have to forgive me.
No, it's great. The phrase social epistemology jumped out at me because it hits for me. When I first got into this, I was really struck by the certainty around the skepticism, and I think I started to, as I researched more and learned more about the subject, I started to feel like that confident skepticism was like profoundly misinformed, and that it sort of hinged on an expectation that we'd done much more research than we actually have, and that there's much less data than there actually is. So at the same time, there's more citing information than I expected, and also there's less research than I expected. So coming in blind, I just assumed we've looked into this and there's nothing to it, and that's why we don't talk about it. And it turns out that that's not really the case at all. People have looked into it, but not on the like broad scale that we've looked into many other interesting scientific questions. So I'm curious about what avenues of inquiry interest you most. And I'm also curious about what some of these intersecting factors are that you pointed to as a kind of like a pileup of complications that this subject presents.
Well, let me actually just start with a comment on the skepticism thing, and then I think we'll go back to the intersecting, and then we can, at the very end, many years from now, return to like the interest factor.
Great.
But I think on the skepticism front, yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, there's a confident skepticism here. It's also a cheap skepticism, and I don't mean anything derogatory by the word cheap here. I mean in the sense of it's cheap in the sense it doesn't require a lot of cognitive resources. There are like nostrums in the general culture they're just kind of baffling. I mean, I guess
I'm sorry, can you define that for us, the non-philosophers? What's a nostrum?
Oh, a nostrum is just like it's like a cliche.
Okay.
It's just like a thing that we say that is not well considered, but that seems like everyone kind of says it, so it must be true.
Okay.
Like, I mean, but immediately, I mean, in this area, in the UAP area, when you start looking at it neutrally, it rapidly becomes Byzantine and confusing almost instantly. I mean, for example, you look at sort of large mainstream public opinion polls that indicate that maybe even more than 50% of the people in this country, in the United States, think that maybe aliens exist and UFOs are real and so forth and so on. And at the same time, like there's a pretty strong taboo or stigma about like if you walk out into public and you say, I'm super into UFOs, like people immediately start laughing at you. And so there's like a strange double consciousness or like split mentality there at the same time where it's like, well, so apparently lots of people kind of take it seriously, but they also think that it's ridiculous, which is strange. I don't quite know how to make sense of this. And I still don't quite know how to make sense of this. And this is just
want to flag there.
Many barriers.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to flag the data that I've seen on that is still pre-Grush, and I like the best numbers are from like Gallup, and I think there's a Pew poll, but they're like 2022, maybe even 2021, and I wouldn't be shocked if we're over 60 or 70% now. I don't know, though. I haven't seen any numbers from 2024. And I would note that the most recent poll from, I believe, Gallup showed the most motion toward belief or openness to the possibility of extraterrestrials or some similar explanation. The most motion in that area was happening from the more educated portions of the society, which kind of suggests that they might be catching up a little bit with some common knowledge. Sorry to interrupt. I just thought that was
no. Please
data.
Constantly interrupt. I'm trying to not interrupt myself and also not go on too long, but please interrupt as much as you want if you don't mind at all. I mean, even here, yet again, we immediately, like, one of the characteristics of the space that stands out to me most, in fact, and so therefore I guess it's something that is of interest to me, although I find it baffling, confusing, and sometimes very frustrating. Even here, we take a right turn into this space and a bunch of questions immediately start rising, like, well, what do people actually mean in these polls when they say, is it just a sort of general vague openness? Is there a meaningful commitment here? What does that commitment actually entail? It's very unclear to me. I mean, you could find, Gallup style polls about people, like what percentage of the population believes in angels, but it's unclear what it actually means to say, well, 52% of the populace believes in angels. Not even just as an academic who's prone to splitting hairs, which I am, but as just a basic person, I'm not exactly sure what it means to say that. Like, what does that mean? Are they willing to jump off a cliff because they'll be caught by one? Or is it just sort of a vague, well, there's no cost attached to the belief, so why not? I'm open-minded. Or is it that they find it interesting? Or is that they're curious? Or is that they have a well-formed, articulate belief with defined terms where you could say, what do you mean when you say you think that UFOs exist or you believe in angels? And they would be able to tell you. I mean, those are the kinds of questions that always immediately come to my mind.
Yeah.
I think it's often very frustrating for the people I'm talking to because I oftentimes don't feel like I know exactly what they mean when they say certain kinds of things about what they believe in and what that actually translates out into or what that actually signifies. And so it's like a nice number, but it's not immediately evident what it means exactly. So I agree with you, but I also I want to know more about if you say, or if Gallup says, or if Gallup conducts a poll and 50 or 60% of people say they believe in X, Y, or Z, what that actually translates out into, or what they think they mean when they say that they believe in this, that, or the other. I think those are questions that actually aren't particularly well defined or tractable at this point in time. I mean, this space is so amorphous, it's simultaneously full of opportunity and sometimes difficult to get purchase on what we're talking about.
100%. And I think you're right to point to this strange tension between a relative openness socially to the idea and a relative closedness publicly, if that makes any sense to draw such a distinction.
Absolutely. There's like a social script or code surrounding the space that is still very present, actually. I mean, because I talk to people, other academics who are working in various areas of the space pretty regularly now. And, we talk in a certain kind of way because we're pursuing whatever, the life of the mind, well-formed hypotheses, trying to articulate research questions, research programs, trying to produce scholarly literature that will go out for peer review and things like this. And that's one ballgame. But I still very much think, you look at the way often, not always, and perhaps less now than at previous times, certainly, but often you look at media commentary and things like this, and you still have the same set of cliches being deployed in a pretty regular way of like the giggle factor, it's that Shostak talks about, or the invocation of little green men, etc., etc. It's like still very much present in the space. I think that's alive and well. I don't know that that's going anywhere anytime soon, but there's certainly more tension between those two discourses now, and that's interesting to observe.
And I think this maybe can nudge us toward one of your interested areas of inquiry, one of the areas of inquiry in which you are interested. I wanted to ask you about the challenges of creating frameworks for hypothetical scenarios, because it seems like one of the ways in which you're tackling this ambiguity and this social skepticism, which is, warranted in some respect at least, is to engage with the possibility of, say, an extraterrestrial presence or some other kind of non-human agency in the sphere of human affairs. And you have made an argument in some of the reading that you sent to me that it's worth doing that sort of prospectively, whether or not we have like good evidence or strong enough information to make bold truth claims about say like the existence of an alien presence on Earth, you argue that it still makes sense intellectually to kind of complete the project or engage with the project of moving toward how we should think about ourselves in relation to such a subject or a group of thinkers, and how we should kind of prepare society to engage with that possibility. And that it makes sense whether or not we know yet whether it's real. In fact, it actually makes more sense to do it before we get that confirmation, because we don't want to be scrambling when we one day encounter ET, if we do. Does that sound right? And does it light any good fires for you?
I would actually sort of back up slightly from there. I mean, I think so. Like, I'm a political theorist, so I'm not doing empirical work. Unlike I think many of the people you maybe have talked to on your show before. You know, I'm not an empirical scientist or a scientist at all, really. You know, I'm an intellectual historian and a political theorist, and so what I'm principally interested in is the conceptual architectures that humans use to navigate the world and to orient themselves in the world toward various things, each other, other concepts of note like nature, the environment, or human rights, responsibilities, moral obligations, strategic actions, emerging crises, things like this. Now, in the real world, those things are not concepts, or they're not only concepts, right? Climate change is not a concept. So you know, there's no presumption that if we properly amend or revise our concept of nature, for example, that's not going to fix climate change. It's just not. Like, climate change is the thing that's happening. It's happening in a non-conceptual space in the world, whatever that is exactly. It is a thing that's happening. There's real costs and consequences to it. But we relate to things through conceptual mediations. Like, we have concepts and we orient ourselves. I mean, we see we have a sense of what is possible and desirable. And this is partly mediated through the conceptual architectures that we see the world through, that structure our vision, so to speak, intellectually and emotionally and socially. So these things are not conceptual problems, but concepts are one of the many tools that we use to orient ourselves towards them. And oftentimes our concepts go unexamined. We take it for granted. We say 50% of people in the country believe in aliens, as if we know what that means immediately. But oftentimes the question is like, well, what do we mean by alien? And it's not an abstract, I mean, it is a very abstract question, but it's not a meaninglessly abstract question, because if someone comes to you and they say that they believe in something or they don't believe in something, if you don't know what they're talking about, if there's no conceptual clarity or precision there, there's nothing that you can really do with this exactly, except start trying to figure out what they're talking about, like what assumptions are laden in the speech that they're using and the actions that they're taking. So like there's all kinds of examples we could dive into, you know, if this was a seminar or a classroom, about how different concepts affect the decisional parameters and the perceptions of the world that people employ when they're doing all kinds of things, whether they're very like complex or abstract stacks to do with international relations and national interests and security concerns and things like this, or even really basic ones like walking to the bus stop at a certain time. You know, we are conceptual animals. We use concepts. They're tools that we use to orient ourselves in the world. And so one of the things I want to do as an intellectual historian and a political theorist is to slow things down, try to identify what conceptual material is actually operative in a given space, and make that explicit in a very careful, kind of slow way, and then suggest revisions on whatever basis. You know, if we go back to the climate change and philosophy of nature stuff, questions about the relation between nature and politics have been operative in Western philosophical tradition for more than 2,000 years, and they actually really seriously inflect how we think about climate change solutions and politics in relation to the environment and the nature of the organism in relation to its environment. I mean, this would be a really classic example. I could digress on for a long time, but I won't right now. So I think before we get into the question of hypothetical responses or how governments would respond if there was extraterrestrial contact or something like this, there needs to be some clarity about what we are talking about when we talk about aliens. And I think in the UAP space, particularly, as much, and I mean, if I go out on the limb and say it, like as much pleasant prevarication and well-justified uncertainty there is about what is operative in this space, there is an immense background cultural association of the UAP thing with aliens fundamentally. Mm-hmm. But largely, I have never seen that explored in a particularly serious way vis-a-vis concepts of aliens or what we are talking about when we talk about things like consciousness or intelligence or organisms or strategic actors for that matter. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are highly operative in space, and so some attention should be given to them.
So that made me think of the working title of the book that you're in process of developing right now, which as it currently stands, I believe is A Theory of the Alien, or The Theory of the Alien, Why We Need One.
It's called Theory of the Alien, and the subtitle is, what is the subtitle? I think it's Space Power, Politics of the Outside or something. Astropolitics, Space Power, and Politics of the Outside. I think it's what it's called, something like this. It's a working title. I mean, the book is very much in its early stages. So we can dive more into that, and we can talk more about the contextual framing stuff, because it's very much in process. It's, currently an incoherent mess that I'm struggling around, thrashing around inside of, which I think is pretty common when you find an academic in the middle of their book instead of with a book to sell you, which I don't have.
Well,
so
everybody should go buy Noir Materialism while you wait for.
No, I don't know about that. It's very much it's very much priced for university libraries at the moment, which is often what happens with early scholarly books. And so, it's wonderful if people do buy it, but it's mainly priced so that university libraries will buy it and it can sit and molder on a shelf somewhere.
Go tell your university library to buy Noir Materialism. But meanwhile, maybe we can help in this conversation. Maybe this conversation can be a useful place for you to thrash around. I'll just ask you a big ropey question like, what do you mean when you say we need a theory of the alien?
Oh, well, the simple answer to the question is, I have yet to, this may be an overstatement, so apologies to any listener who objects and does or has told me so, and I've forgotten or misrepresenting them. But very loosely speaking, I have yet to meet someone who has been able to give a clear conceptual statement of what an alien is or would be. I guess. I mean, there is actually, we'll just kind of skip to the end here. I mean, there does seem to be conceptual material here, and the primary conceptual assumption is that, well, aliens are unknown and they're radically different in some way. Insofar as aliens, I mean, the primary caution in this space, insofar as it's engaged with at all in academic literature, I think it's sometimes engaged with in ufological literature. We can actually talk about that because that's the chapter I'm in the middle of right now, and so that is interesting to talk about. But more abstractly, but more confusingly, to start with at least, it often seems to me, based on review of the literature and engagement with this space, that the concept of the alien that is most operative at present is that it is absolutely other, that it is completely different, and that it is very important to avoid any possible assumption that if aliens exist, that aliens are like us in any particular way, cognitively or linguistically or psychologically or biologically. There seems to be an immense concern about the creep or contamination of anthropocentric assumptions into alien-type talk, hypothetically. When we're talking about aliens hypothetically, oftentimes this is the concern that seems to be vocalized. And I've seen it vocalized in the very small academic, it is very small, the very small academic literature on the subject. And then in some conversations with non-academics and other kinds of positions, there's this concern about assuming that if aliens exist, that they are anything like us in any particular way. And I think this is an interesting concern. It is not well explicated as of yet, and I also am suspicious of it, I guess I would say, as a first shot.
How would you feel about a simple definition like alien intelligence is any non-human but human equivalent or superior intelligence? Well, I guess period. How would you feel about that? Equivalent or superior but non-human intelligence?
What do you mean by intelligence?
All right. Good question.
It's not a gotcha question. It's a really real question. It's like there ends up being this sort of cat chasing its own tail effect in this space where we pose the question of what are we talking about when we talk about aliens, and then we fill in another term that is unanalyzed. And then if we look at that term, then we fill in another term. So you end up in this sort of strange circular space where it's like, well, aliens are conscious or aliens are intelligent, and intelligence is conscious, but it's this or that or the other. I mean, when you start looking into the conceptual backstory, because this is one of the things I do. It's not about playing word games, and it's not just about sort of an infinite conceptual like like salad that you're just sort of sorting through endlessly. But there's no easy term that just fits in that like doesn't itself have a kind of complicated conceptual backstory.
Mm.
So, like, what do we mean by what do we actually mean by intelligence? And there's, of course, a literature on this, and people will bring up IQ or animal intelligence or problem-solving capacities or linguistic aptitudes
Mm-hmm.
or any number of ways to try to not just quantify, sometimes quantify, but either quantify or achieve conceptual precision about what we're talking about when we talk about intelligence in the first place. Although the same kinds of problems come up yet again of what we are actually talking about and how you get purchase on it, how you like apprehend or comprehend what is being talked about in the space. So I realize I'm bouncing the question back at you. It's not about like a Socratic dialogue of like making you answer the question exactly, as I'm trying to underscore like the underlying difficulty here of getting to a position where we have clarity of what it is we're actually referring to without just picking a set of familiar or comfortable assumptions that we like and saying, well, an alien would be an intelligence, or an alien would be an intelligence that is as intelligent as we are, because even in very ordinary language, immediately we would wonder like what that means and what we're talking about there.
Yeah, and also you could imagine an alien tree that is not particularly intelligent or
Sure.
more intelligent than us.
Or, finding a bacteria on Mars or a fossilized bacteria on Mars would certainly qualify as an extraterrestrial life form. Like, I think that's relatively straightforward. So we would say, like in at least some ordinary language parlance, we would say, well, that's an alien. Like, alien life's been discovered. There's a fossil bacteria on Mars. Alien life confirmed. Some kind of problem has been solved here. Some kind of question has been answered about the emergence of life in different planetary spaces or something like that. And that is like obviously interesting, relevant, etc. But I'm actually not sure that it gets to the heart of the issue that is most operative in the UAP space in particular. Like, there's something going on in the space that actually is not it's not resolved if a fossil bacteria is discovered on Mars, for example. And you start to get a sense of the scale of the discourses that are colliding with each other in these spaces, where you just sort of have this unsorted bucket of material that, like, the SETI people are in it, and the astrobiology people are in it, and the ufology people are in it, and the science fiction people are in it, and the like philosophers of mind and science are in it. This bucket is just overflowing with a bunch of things that don't obviously cohere or play well together, and that is an interesting epistemological morass in and of itself.
Do you think it's even useful to define alien as any non-human intelligence, or do you think we want to dial in a little bit more specifically and separate ideas out, like bacteria on Mars versus like a human level sentience from Alpha Centauri versus, like, I don't know, a spirit being from the 8th dimension? Like, is it some, I've heard some people, like the first guest on this show, Dr. Stephen Brown, who we love and respect, basically use alien as the bucket term for other non-human intelligence. And from his point of view, sort of epistemologically, he's not particularly interested in parsing any further right now. He just wants to engage people in the project of thinking about what some people refer to as NHI, non-human intelligence. And so he's just using the term alien to mean NHI, anything that's, roughly equivalent to us, but isn't either of us or maybe from here, is a little dicey because you get into the like Atlantean and Silurian theories about, ancient civilizations.
Sure.
Or future humans or whatever. So just like alien is like, you're just distinguishing between current humanity and whatever this equivalent or superior intelligence is that we're engaging with. Do you think that's a useful like bucket to put things in, or do you think we should have sub containers for these more specific ideas, or both of those things? And how do we move? How can this help us move toward sort of like practical steps in the real world? How can this like delineation and definition help advance our scientific and political projects?
Yeah. So here's a perspective answer. I mean, the first part is a quibble. Again, I'm an academic, so it's obligatory, or I'll lose my license. Right? It's like, I don't really like the term non-human intelligence, but the reason why is because there's already like tons of non-human intelligences here on the planet. Like, my dog is a non-human intelligent. I mean, she can't do calculus, she can't drive a car, she can't hold a job, she brings no money into the household, but she is intelligent. She solves problems all day, every day, mostly how to get up and down from a couch, how to stay warm, how to indicate when she wants things in various ways to me. This is in a very bare minimum sense, is an intelligent creature. She is not a human. She's non-linguistic, etc. Like she meets some kind of ordinary language basic sniff test of a non-human intelligence, and that's great.
Good
and
point.
So I don't think non-human intelligence cuts the mustard. I mean, once you start adding qualifiers to it, it starts to get more interesting. When you say, well, comparably intelligent, although this term intelligence is haunting the space now, like, so what are we actually talking? Like, you can talk to each other. Like, you might reformulate this in terms of like some kind of interlinguistic compatibility where you can communicate with each other. I mean, this might be a way of going of like a sort of mutual communicative possibility or prospect or something like this. I think that's potentially extremely promising. I mean, again, I'll kind of skip to the end instead of going through the whole laborious and probably befuddled thought process of my part. I want to say it has something to do with political interaction. I mean, actually, like, to really just skip to the end in a way, and we can go back and backfill or debate or however you want to approach it. But what we're talking about when we talk about the alien is actually something like another political agent that you can do politics with in some meaningful way. And of course, this doesn't really clarify anything, because to play by the rules of the game I'm playing, it's like, what do you mean by politics? What are you talking about? What is politics? You want to say it's politics or intelligence or whatever. We have to be able to give some account of that. But I think there is something very practically and strategically minded when we parse this in terms of the possibility of political action and interaction is actually what is most interesting and relevant here. And I think this is a pretty, not a minoritarian position exactly, but I don't think it's a particularly common one, actually.
Super intriguing. I guess let's use this to pick up on the fact that you reviewed Dr. Bolander's work for the first edition of Limina. We're going to speak with Dr. Bolander in a couple of months, but
great.
They're very busy. So meanwhile, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that project, because you engaged with this work about preparing global law for the potential of engaging with ET. And I like where your head is at here in terms of thinking about political interaction as kind of like the relevant scale at which we would start to mutually define each other. Would you like to explore that? Is that interesting territory for you right now?
I think I'll probably end up doing a little bit of violence to Michael's book, which is very good and people should read. But I'm going to be a bit reductionistic about my big takeaway from his book. And there's also a comparable book, which I would recommend. I think if you put these two books together, you have an interesting starting place that's actually very productive, despite the fact that everything I'm about to say sounds kind of negative, not about the books, which are both excellent, but about our humans, our like the current state of thoughts, orientation towards this stuff. So there's Michael Ballander's book, and then there's this book called Deep Space Warfare by John Wright, who I think is like a strategic and military theorist. Actually, Ballander talks about this book in at least one of the chapters in his book about human rights law and like the legal impact of a potential extraterrestrial contact event.
Interesting. And Michael Ballander's book is Contact with Extraterrestrial Intelligence and Human Law.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. I guess my takeaway from both of those books in a lot of ways actually was we're totally unprepared. And not only are we totally unprepared for a contact event, but our conceptual and material infrastructures and architectures are completely and totally unprepared for any kind of contact event in any meaningful way whatsoever. In John C. Wright's book's case, it's, I think, particularly apparent because, it's a very serious book about militarization of outer space, military action in outer space, and strategic theory vis-a-vis not just the planets, but like what military action in particularly deep space would look like. And the answer in a lot of ways is we don't have the technological capacity for it. We don't think about conflict or space in the sense of space you move through and navigate with technological devices. We don't have it. We have no way of defending this planet. like we don't have, planetary or deep space technologies that can do this. I think if you look at like Nicholas Schmidt, who is an international relations theory in Prague, I think at Masaryk University, he does work on planetary defense, which is, I think, a very similar kind of takeaway is like, we don't have a planetary defense network. We don't have the capacity to project force in outer space. If there was conflict in outer space or deep space, we're largely unprepared for it, that we don't really have the capacity to do it, and we don't really think in those terms. And is this a problem? I don't know, but it certainly seems like a thing that we can't do. So it's certainly an incapacity. Whether that's a problem or not is a different question, perhaps. I think similarly in Ballander's case is like our concepts of human rights law, of conflict mitigation, of how to deal with disputes in terms of international law and things like this doesn't map very well onto a potential contact event. And there's a lot of open questions here. And some of these are empirical questions, in all fairness, is like, well, we don't know what a contact event would be like, and we don't know what the parties on the other side of that strategic divide would be like, or what they would want, or how well we would communicate that with them, or what the disparities in technological capacity or psychological inclination would be like. We just don't know, or at least I don't know, and I don't think Michael or John would say they know either. But the takeaway in a lot of ways is that we are completely unprepared, certainly, and potentially like there's an incapacity here of like how a response would take place. So this actually raises a lot of really interesting questions for me as a theorist of like, so what are the concepts that are at play here that contribute to this deep, really deep incapacity to actually take it seriously, even hypothetically in a serious kind of way? What do you think about that? Is it a cause for despair? Is it confusion? Are we not doing our jobs as academics? Is it just an empirical issue where, if you cross a certain Rubicon of specificity and aliens show up and they say, hello, we're here to take your stuff, or we're here to give you free stuff, then suddenly everything changes? I'm not exactly sure. What do you think?
So you make this point in your book proposal that confronting this wicked problem is still better than ignoring it, even though the problem is sort of mind-breakingly hard. And you mentioned, well, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, well, it's a risk issue. There's a really strange feature of risks in particular, which is risks are real, but they haven't happened yet, and they might never happen. Like a risk that becomes real, we call a catastrophe or a crisis or an accident or something like this when it happened. Like, think about the analogy to car insurance and driving your car around. When you were driving your car around, there is some known or unknown quantification of risk that goes along with driving your car around, because you could have an accident at any time. But until you have had an accident, you haven't had one yet. The risk isn't real. Like in the sense of it hasn't happened. You haven't had the accident until you have. But the very second you have an accident, you're out of risk land and you're in, well, my car's all screwed up and I have to like deal with this and get a tow truck and stuff like this. You're not dealing with the risk anymore. Now you're dealing with consequences. So like we're really bad as humans. Humans are extremely bad. Maybe this is a native pessimism on my part or something, but humans are extraordinarily bad at thinking about risks because there's always this not unreasonable temptation to say, well, it hasn't happened, so it probably won't. I have never had a car accident. It would be very strange to say, I've never had a car accident, so I probably won't. And yet there's still that temptation to say, oh, I'm good at driving, or I'm a lucky guy, or something like this. But in reality, there is some unknown quantifier of risk attached to every single time I get in my car and I go to work. And so how do we deal with that unknown quantification of how much risk? And, it changes if it's icy or if there's lots of traffic or something like this. But you have car insurance. It's basically the answer here is like you have car insurance because there is a risk that you will have a car accident. And they have, actuaries who try to figure out and quantify that. And that's what you get charged. And that's what the payout is and all this kind of boring bureaucratic stuff about your car insurance. But car insurance is about something that hasn't happened yet, but might happen, but it might never. And if you just approached, paying for car insurance with the sense that you can imagine you look back over a whole accident-free life and you said, man, they really ripped me off because thousands and thousands of dollars went to protect me from something that never happened. If your conclusion was, so I guess it's not real and I should never have paid them a dime and just driven uninsured the whole time, that would actually be the wrong conclusion.
And we make these trade-offs about the priorities of our resources in terms of what kind of risks we're protecting ourselves from.
And so in this space, I think the common thought, and I think particularly on the part of governments and for lack of a better word, like mainstream strategic theorists is, well, it's just not very likely for X, Y, Z, which is I'm laughing because I have no idea where the confidence of the probability assessment comes from. And one can make, I think, the risk of sounding too derogatory, some noises about various sensibilities of like what prospective intersolar transportation would be like or something like this, but it's just like it's guesswork. It's all guesswork, but the risk is potentially very high. I mean, the risk, I think Bollender is particularly excellent on this in his book, which I would recommend, is Bollender gets that the risk is actually very high because it is partly so amorphous and unknown, I guess you would say. I mean, the risk is potentially, if aliens, for example, if aliens showed up tomorrow in a bunch of ships around the planet, I mean, the risk has suddenly become real and you're in a completely helpless position. It's the kind of event that the realization of that risk would be devastating because we have no real response to it. There would be nothing much to be done. People would make up stuff and they would pretend to do things, and people would do all sorts of things or try, presumably. But this is where the John Wright book comes in, I think, quite well. It's like there's Agor and Nicola Schmidt. We don't really have any material capacity to respond. So it's a strange space where it's like it's a severe risk, but a risk that isn't taken seriously because it is perceived as improbable, or more disturbingly, because we don't have a ready response to the prospect of that risk becoming real, it is discarded. But that is really very concerning. I mean, you're moving now into the sort of, well, there's nothing to be done, so let's just not think about it kind of space, which I think is like extremely imprudent.
It does seem at least potentially possible that there are folks on the inside of the higher echelons of the militaries of the world who are dealing with this problem in a real concrete way. And you could at least imagine a scenario where some of these people or their agencies for decades now have been grappling with this and saying, there's not much we can do. We haven't solved the problem yet, and we don't want to kind of go wide with it in a phase during which we haven't solved the problem, and then say, what, aliens are real and we can't protect you? That does not sound like a compelling public address. So
Indeed.
I do want to, I guess, tease out, if you have any thinking, some of these ideas about how we might approach a radical power imbalance if this does turn out to be the case. Like if we meet an extraterrestrial presence anytime in the next, say, 1,000 years, there's a pretty good chance that we're going to be behind wherever they are. If we're a very advanced civilization, we make it another 1,000,000 years, then maybe we'll start bumping into sort of prehistoric level civilizations out there. But we're still early enough in the game that I think it's reasonable to guess that we might have an asymmetric advantage, or an asymmetric disadvantage in this political circumstance.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering what, if any, ideas you might have about this. You mentioned again in your book proposal, or maybe it was in your review of Bollender, the concepts of rights. And you used a phrase that I didn't understand, network regulation density. And you talked about rights hierarchies and enforcement mechanisms, which I understood a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, these are Bollender's terms. I mean, these are terms that come out of currently extant international rights law, basically.
Oh, okay.
And that basically, to boil it down to brass tacks. I feel like that's certainly a metaphor. That is definitely a mixed metaphor that probably makes no sense. But to reduce it to a very straightforward response, I mean, he's talking about whether or not we would be able to enforce any of our legal architectures or infrastructures in any meaningful way, given the kind of asymmetric disadvantage that you're talking about. And its conclusion, I believe, is pretty soundly no. I mean, it may just be that the kinds of legal and conceptual infrastructures we have developed over the past couple of hundred years for trying to regulate political conflict just don't apply when these kinds of asymmetries or epistemological gaps obtain. I mean, I think that's almost certainly correct. So again, I want to kind of reverse course a bit from these very practical questions, which I don't have an answer to. I mean, I think Bollender and Wright are good examples of very frank, serious, and sustained analyses of the fact that we, like, at a species level, at a planetary level, don't actually have an immediate answer to. But I kind of want to back it up a bit, back into my ivory tower.
Great.
So taking under it this, right? So, I mean, presuming that we don't have a surfeit, a lot of empirical data about aliens, or maybe any. I mean, this is the thing. It's like, I'm agnostic. My book is agnostic. I have no whatever insider knowledge. I'm not an experiencer. I don't have like a strong view on these things. Like, I don't have any special or privileged knowledge in the space, which I think is where most of us are. So presuming that we don't have a surfeit of empirical data about aliens, I guess my bid in the book, and maybe you can help me think through this in this conversation a little bit, that even if we don't have empirical data about aliens, we can nevertheless know something quite concrete about them. At least we can, if aliens are capable of doing politics, which is to say, of taking political actions and engaging in political interactions. Now, of course, we have to be able to understand and articulate what it means for organisms to be capable of doing this. So we have to have a sense of what it means to take a political action or to engage in politics in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But if we understand the sufficiency conditions for being capable of political actions and interactions, then by default, we do know something about all agents who are capable of engaging in political action. I mean, this sounds kind of like thin in a way, but if we know what it means to do politics, then we know something about all agents in the universe, regardless of their underlying ontological composition. What it's angels, it's aliens, it's interdimensional travelers, it's future humans, it's other humans, it's dolphins in the ocean. If they can do politics, if we know what it means to do politics, then we do know something about them. And we know something kind of peculiar about them, because implicit to the idea of doing politics is actually engaging in diplomatic or strategic behavior across divides of difference. Like, the nature of the difference actually becomes secondary if you can trade strategically and diplomatically with other agents who are incapable of engaging in this particular form of behavior. So there's kind of like a strange loophole in this one very particular way, which I think is distinct to politics, maybe more so. I mean, we often default to intelligence or to language or to consciousness, but I'm actually not sure that intelligence, language, or consciousness, just to pick three examples, are better than politics, because in politics you preserve an unknown quantity of difference between the political or strategic actors who are negotiating with each other. It's not about us being the same. Like, we don't have to be the same. In fact, the fact that we're approaching each other strategically in order to exchange information or language or goods or threats or whatever presumes that we're not the same, presumes that we have different packages of interest, so to speak, that we may be pursuing different agendas, we may have different incentives, we may perceive the world differently, we may have different cultural values, there may be all kinds of asymmetries that inflect the space of interaction between the two of us, but it's almost uniquely, I would just say uniquely, it is uniquely in the space of politics where all of those asymmetries are actually accommodated, because we assume that there are asymmetries when you have political and strategic when you have political and strategic actors interacting with each other. We assume there are all kinds of asymmetries, and that those asymmetries are not necessarily being made crystal clear to the other political or strategic actor. Does that make sense? This is kind of actually the direction where I'm coming to this entire problem from, because I'm trying to get away from a bunch of empirical questions that I don't have any capacity to answer, and I'm not actually really confident that anyone can answer it very clearly, or certainly doesn't seem to be. So that's kind of the direction I'm actually coming at this from, I guess, instead of like I'm playing the prediction game or coming to it with some kind of special information, which I don't have.
Well, that's really interesting. And a couple things that it bounced off for me were that first of all, the asymmetry idea is new to me. I hadn't thought about politics as being inherently a relationship between groups with asymmetrical abilities or interests. But the core idea, it seemed to me, in just sort of pondering the concept of politics, is something to do with the relationship between groups and individuals. That when we say politics, we're referring to concepts that necessarily include a group of individuals. So, an independent agent or entity within a larger collection of such entities, whether or not those individuals have particularly creative
Hmm.
freewheeling
Hmm.
independence. I think maybe as a side question, I'm thinking about like beehives
Hmm.
versus like American or Chinese bodies of politics.
Hmm.
Uh, Another thing that this sparked for me was an idea from the Three Body Problem by Liu Cixin. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name exactly. Cixin Liu. Sorry, he has a
Oh,
concept about cosmic sociology, which it sounded similar in some ways to your very clever loophole about politics. That if you can say something about, in his case, life, then you can say something about the nature of cosmic sociology. And so
yeah.
his thinking there is life needs food and the universe is finite, and so life will expand to consume resources, and he sort of derives an imaginary galactic politics from this
Hmm.
core idea. And I think that there's something there that reminded me of this seed that you're poking at with this the idea of politics inherently requiring some differences between individuals and groups, and then some asymmetrical interests, which you would have to expect might sometimes be resolved with force and other times with diplomacy. And can
Yeah,
you?
it doesn't solve the material problem of what happens, right? Politics is a risky business. Like, people die, people lose, things are unfair, things change. There are all kinds of reversals. I mean, even a cursory study of any kind of political history on our planet amongst humans reveals this like very, very rapidly. But the underlying question is, so what is necessary for an entity to engage in political life in the specific sense that we are talking about? And it seems like an answer is something like, well, it has to be able to represent some kind of bid or interest in
Mhm.
some minimally cohesive or coherent way in the field of play, so to speak, in the space of political interaction between the political agents who are interacting with each other. That is like the bare minimum thing. And so it's extremely minimalist. It's extremely minimalist to say, well, the cost of entry into this game is that you are able to accurately or inaccurately or truthfully or deceptively or whatever, it doesn't matter, to represent an interest in a way that is comprehensible to other players of the game, so to speak. That's
Mhm.
actually the bare minimum. If that criterion is satisfied, doesn't matter if it's angels, doesn't matter if it's a collective entity, if it's an individual entity, if it's a guy on the other side of the planet, if it's another nation, if it's an extra galactic civilization, if it's a divinity. It doesn't actually, like, it's ontologically neutral.
Mhm.
It doesn't
Mhm.
matter, like the degree of asymmetry might be so severe that it's like, an agent shows up and it says, we have the super weapon and you have to do what we say. And the other agent says, well, I guess we will because we don't want to die. Like, that's still a political interaction. It's highly asymmetric. It's highly undesirable on the part of probably both parties, but certainly the disadvantaged party. But it is a political interaction. It is like, there is the minimal criterion that I'm sketching out is actually satisfied here.
Mhm.
So it doesn't solve the strategic problem of what do you do if a bigger guy shows up? What do you do if a bigger weapon shows up? What do you do if there's a disparity or an asymmetry in some significant way? That's a practical question. This is this is like a Hobbesian type problem at that point of, I don't know, how do you fight a revolution? How do you defeat a technologically advanced adversary? How do you struggle for justice at the face of injustice, etc.? Like, those are the real substantial problems of political life. But in the space that we're talking about, particularly given that we're not faced with this, right? There aren't like motherships that I'm aware of around the planet that are threatening us and telling us what to do, like that I'm aware of.
Mhm.
Um, that's not the kind of problem that I'm trying to address. The kind of problem I'm trying to address here is how we conceptually frame what we are talking about when we talk about, I don't know how to put it really, like UAP haunted by the specter of the unanalyzed alien or something like
Mm.
this.
So the four
But
concepts.
it does actually have kind of, just very, very quickly, it does
Yeah.
actually have kind of practical consequences in a way, because it changes the nature of the kinds of questions we would ask about these things. Like, the way that we ask these questions right now is largely mediated in an epistemological and scientific way. Are they real? Do they exist? Are they
Mhm.
are UAP misperceptions? Are they constructions? Are claims from competing factions in government and media true or false? Is it what is the nature of the reality that is being described? Is it deceptive? Is it misperception, etc.? It's phenomenological, it's scientific. I'm actually proposing a pretty thoroughgoing reframing of the issue as, instead of a scientific or an astrobiological or a science fictional or a metaphysical or a social epistemological theory of the alien, quote unquote, which is already what seems to be operative in space, what if we approached it politically first and foremost as what kinds of political actions would one take when faced with this kind of a problem of an unknown or partially unknown potential diplomatic partner slash adversary slash political agent? Like, how do you interact with the political agent? Which is a very different kind of question than saying, is it real? What is it? How is it moving? How does it move around in the sky like this? Is it a misperception? Is it a drone? Etc.
And it might
Those are
allow
the
us
kinds
to
of questions that are, yeah, go ahead.
It might allow us to ask some interesting questions about their different qualities. I just wanted to quickly note that thinking about your concept of politics here and how we can apply it universally dropped out 4 concepts for me: individual, group, interest, and communication. And I wondered if I was maybe missing any. So like the individuals, the interests they have, the communication they use to represent these to each other, and then the groups they form to negotiate these interests. Those 4 seemed like important conceptual corners to the idea of a political entity. And then I thought, based on that, we could use this idea of a political agent as a like a universal political agent to ask interesting questions, like what kind of autonomy do your individuals have? What kind of organizations politically might be likely to evolve spaceflight, for example. We just spoke to a really fascinating scientist named Robert Powell a couple weeks ago, whose book you should read if you haven't. It's UFOs, A Scientist Explains What We Know and What We Don't. And one of his ideas about this is that spaceflight might tend to favor benevolent civilizations because they would have had to overcome a great filter and not destroyed themselves on their own planet to get to another place. But I posited to him that it could also favor a totalitarian style, like political organization where a group was highly adept at controlling its population and maybe moved more like a beehive or an ant colony. Does that spark anything interesting for you, like in terms of
so
these concepts might allow us to ask?
To approach it as a political theory of the alien as opposed to a scientific or astrobiological or science fictional theory of the alien, which is already operative in the space, I mean, there is a transformative effect here, I think. I think it will seem kind of underwhelming, but I don't think it is. So it changes the kinds of inquiries that we make, and perhaps in a downstream way, it might change the kinds of actions that we take vis-a-vis trying to like operationalize these inquiries. So, for example, maybe I'm mistaken, but mostly I see both academic and popular discussions and inquiries about aliens or UAP or UFOs or whatever. They're articulated in terms of confirming or questioning the existence of these things. Do they really exist? What are they like, etc.? Sometimes exploring epistemological complexities about how do we know and how do we talk about things that are unknown or partially unknown. Information flows, and there's all kinds of information asymmetries in space. Or speculating about knowledge formation and dissemination, particularly historically, or the motives of different human, governmental, cultural actors, and so forth, both in the present and in the past. But the common framework here mostly is scientific, I think, at its best. Like, there's really good work here, and empirical scientific research should be pursued and rigorously and should be free to do so. Obviously, I'm not saying that it shouldn't. Or it's purely anthropocentric, meaning there's critical discourse about our democratic possibilities or the status of legacy programs or the prospect of financial malfeasance, these kinds of things. But if we take up the idea of aliens and UAP, it's something other than just foreign drones or experimental technologies or other relatively quotidian things that seem less quotidian because they have these unknown features or something like this, then we could consider them as real or prospective political agents, I guess. I mean, this is a place like this is very untested and like information kind of space, because like we interact with other political agents strategically all the time, and there's all kinds of information asymmetries when we do so. Like, we don't know what they want, we don't know if the signals they're sending are I want to say verisimilitudinous, but that's too many syllables. Like, we don't know if the signal is reliable or deceptive. but we do know, like, what is salient about political agents is what they want and what they're doing and what their disposition is and what incentives they respond to and how to open or close diplomatic channels of communication with them, how to try to affect behavior effectively or ineptly, depending on what it is we're trying to do. But those are like totally different kinds of questions and behaviors. Like there is some practical consequence of approaching. I mean, just to put it very baldly, there's some kind of practical consequence in approaching the UAP question as a political problem that's not about just us, like our politics of who says what to whom and why and do we trust them or whatever. But instead, if you take the phenomenon prospectively seriously as a political agent, you're not actually even committing to like wacky UFO stuff or something. It's about changing the kind of inquiry and behavior that you're orienting towards the thing in question. And it's actually about taking the risk seriously and getting some traction on something that largely otherwise seems to be mostly intractable. Does that kind of respond to your question?
Yeah, and it nudged us toward another interesting area of your work, which is the concept of the space age and how humanity will inherently necessarily change by stepping into space. And that also happens to be a concept that Liu explores in Three Body. Have you read that series?
I have.
You nodded yes? Big.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm a big fan. I thought it was very creative and deep and complex. And if anybody has made it halfway through the first book and feels it's too slow, hang in there because it really does.
Yeah, it takes off.
Ramp up. But he explores this idea that we're inherently, once we leave Earth, there's something about that part of humanity which changes irrevocably and becomes a new, different thing. And it sounded to me in some of the work that you sent me that you've been exploring this idea a little bit too, that there's like a transformation humanity's inherently undergoing by stepping into the space age. And I have one little quote from you about that maybe can be a bouncing off point. You say, in order to get anywhere at all, we have to leave ourselves behind. In order to find our way back, even to the planet we currently live on, we must undergo some species of meaningful departure from it. So I was going to ask you, what aspects of our humanity do you imagine might change in the process of engaging with the space age and preparing for potential ET contact? Big one. Just an easy question.
It makes me sound weird.
That's because I read something within all conversational. But yeah, what are some of the ways in which you think this is changing us?
I mean, so boring first, I guess, is like, we already depend on. I mean, you can split hairs about low Earth orbit or translunar orbits or whatever, but just in a very basic sort of sense, in the most relevant, geographically relevant sense, like we depend on our outer space infrastructure immensely every day, particularly in developed countries. You have a credit card in your wallet, you pay for something at Starbucks, that is involving outer space infrastructures around this planet. The conversation we're currently having, mediated through digital infrastructures, it touches on satellite architectures and things like this. Financial transactions, emails, bank transactions. I mean, you are touching outer space and outer space is touching you. Our infrastructure there every day, multiple times a day in the most basic quotidian sense. I mean, I've noticed since I've started pursuing this book project that in talking to other political theorists and like non-political theorists, just non-academics even, is there still this sort of aura of the fantastic about outer space stuff? Like it's sci-fi, it's wacky, it's like distant, it's like speculative. It's like there's people and they've got the glass bubble helmets on and they're like walking around on purple planets or something. It's kind of zany, it's kind of out there. And I'm like, no, it's in your wallet, it's in your phone. Like you text your children, you buy stuff, you are like, we are immensely dependent on this. And it's very much tied up with like the planet. And like, this is something that's barely 100 years old from an intellectual historical perspective. The notion of living on a planet that is bounded and constrained is really barely 100 years old or so. I mean, prior to that, you had this sense for like a really long time, hundreds and hundreds of years of sort of open territory, not just in the sense of like the American frontier or something, but in the sense of like the world hasn't been mapped. Everything in it's not known. I mean, of course, everything in it's not known now, but we have this sense of like living in planetary space, whereas like it's just whatever, it's hot, flat, and crowded. I mean, I can't stand that guy, but it's like it's a decent metaphor for this like sense of constrained planetary space, and this has a lot of consequences for how we think about territory and how we think about connectivity and stuff like this. So it's like we're in the very early. I mean, we may not ever get out of the early days of the space age because we may decide to do something else, like blow ourselves up or whatever. But we're in the very, very early days of the space age. I mean, again, you have this kind of strange double think here, where on the one hand, there's a sense of anything to do with outer space is kind of fantastic and possibly distant and inaccessible. And then on the other hand, you have this sort of simultaneous sense of like, well, that's sort of retro. It's kind of played out. It's like we went to the moon, there was nothing there, and then like the space shuttle was weird, and then we got distracted and started doing other things. So like it's difficult, arid, expensive, and kind of stupid. And so like why bother? Or like in a sense, I'm somewhat friendly toward and somewhat unfriendly towards. Like we have a lot of problems here, and we should fix them instead of spending an immense amount of capital and also like problematic military, industrial, foundational stuff that goes into getting anything into space, keeping it there, and doing anything with it in the first place. And of course, there's a lot of like issues to explore and discuss there, but there is a sense where these questions of the terrestrial and the extraterrestrial in a very basic spatial sense is actually something that is extremely operative and extremely relevant for basically every person walking around the face of the planet, like right now, today. It's not just like an abstraction in a possible future of like a billionaire's fantasy of doing something any more than it is just like played out and done, and there's nothing else to be done with it. It's like it's something that is happening, and it's not just happening, it's like literally happening right now, and like we're using it at this precise moment. Like what we're doing is partially mediated through these infrastructures. So I think a lot of interesting political, theoretical, and anthropological questions come out about the status of the species and how it engages in itself, to put it kind of obscurely, like as a planetary species that has a sense of itself as a planetary species. So there's this contrastive space of outer space, is put it sort of awkwardly, that's like highly relevant here. That was a sort of elongated answer to your question, maybe, but.
Well, one interesting thing it made me think of is that at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about nature a little bit, and like the sort of blurry line, or blurrier than you might think, between nature and humanity. When you go looking for that line, it's harder to parse than you might intuitively expect. And then similarly, you mentioned looking up toward the stars. There's this easy to imagine bright line between us and alien intelligence. But as we move into the stars and transcend our home world, we're going to start to blur that line. We may begin to blur the line between humanity and intelligence from other places. So I think it's just kind of a beautiful moment that we're in as a species, connecting this spectrum a little bit more richly. I also wanted to ask you about your UAP Studies Journal project. I don't know much about that, and you flagged it as something you were working on. Is that still operative for you?
No, it's good. It's under review right now. So, one of the first things that happened when I started talking to some of these other academics who work on this space is I bumped into Mike Safone, who I think you interviewed some months ago.
Yes, friend of the pod.
Yeah, and he asked me to serve in advisory capacity in the advisory board of the Society for UAP Studies, which I was happy to do, slightly reluctant to do. I mean, it's a very conventional, legitimate academic society, and conventional and legitimate here are complements, right? It's not a, and no shade on anyone else doing anything else, but it is not a ufology organization. It's a scholarly society that is trying to bring together scholars to do various kinds of work. And so they have I'm not that involved in the day-to-day admin of that society, and it like does good work. They bring in speakers give talks. The speakers are really across the spectrum of disciplines and interests. And we had Adam Frank give a talk last year, and Greg Agigian and other people like this. Greg Agigian is a history professor at Penn State, I believe, and Adam Frank is like a astrobiologist I think he's at some Ivy. I don't remember where offhand, but he's written like some popular, very successful books about astrobiology stuff. So in talks with the advisory board and other people involved with sort of the admin side of the scholarly society, one of the cases I wanted to make is that touching on this UAP issues or UAP studies, broadly speaking, shouldn't just be confined to the society journal. You have a lot of scholarly societies. I mean, the example that comes to my mind, as a society I'm very fond of, is the Melville Society. And these are scholars from a variety of backgrounds who work on Herman Melville and his books and literature and stuff like this. And that's great. Melville studies, it's a thing. They have a journal called Leviathan. It's very good. You have specialist academic papers about Melville and all sorts of ways they get published there. And that's great. This is like a healthy part of any like intellectual ecosystem. But, I made a proposal at the time, which is that I wanted to try to build a special issue for a completely independent journal, like a high impact, humanities theory, cross-disciplinary kind of journal, like a high impact journal that would be on the topic of UAP studies specifically. It would solicit a number of scholars to contribute papers to that special issue. Like a special issue in academic land is it's like you have a journal and they publish articles, they go through the full double-blind peer review process on a regular rolling basis, but you sometimes have these things called special issues, which are about a specific topic. And it brings together a range of scholars from disciplines who are showcasing what it looks like and what work in that particular topical area looks like for the purposes of the special issue that is bound together by that like topical theme. Okay. So, I solicited people, Mike and I solicited people and got them together. They're not primarily people from the Society of UAP Studies. They're actually mostly people who aren't. I think it's less than like 30% of them are actually from the Society in the first place. We built inquiries and relations with a variety of people from Cornell and Tel Aviv and Brown University, University of South Carolina, a range of other places, Penn State, etc., to give papers that showcase what it looks like for current working scholars, many of whom are tenured, some of whom are early career scholars, but who are doing work in some capacity in some discipline on the UAP issue, like from a perspective of taking this emergent domain of research, UAP studies, seriously, and then showing off what it looks like. And we are, we give the proposal and the abstracts to the journal in question, and we have no relationship with them. They review the proposal, it goes under full review, they make a decision, then the papers are written, and then the papers are reviewed. So it's kind of an elongated process, but no one has really quite done anything like this before. I mean, you have different disciplines, history, religious studies, philosophy, etc., where you have bits, and nothing like negative, but like bits and bobs scholarship, like you have a paper here and a paper there kind of thing. But the attempt to make this special issue is really an attempt to showcase what a emergent UAP studies that is independent and genuinely cross-disciplinary actually looks like, and to showcase what work there looks like. So we have, for example, we have a person from comparative literature and a person from history, religious studies scholar or two, one of whom is taking a very historical tack on like the history of UFO religions in the United States, and one of whom is taking an approach that's orientated towards phenomenology and like hypothesis formation. We have philosopher of science. We have some international relations people talking about security crises. So it's a really broad spectrum approach that is trying to showcase what it would look like in a neutral, non-affiliated way for scholars who don't particularly know each other and have been solicited independently by the editor me to do work in the space. So that is so it's trying to define that through showing off what it looks like and actually say this is a domain of study and legitimate scholarly inquiry and work comparable to other kinds of studies. It's kind of a catch-all term of like you'll have XYZ studies, ABC studies, and all sorts of ways, like religious studies, etc. What that would actually look like. That's what we're trying to do. So it's under review right now, but it's been formulated, the proposal's been written, it's been submitted, it's currently under review. And
interesting. So to whom did you submit this, or
because the proposal itself is under review, I don't want to say the journal in question.
Okay,
but it is a high impact international theory journal, and by theory journal, I mean what I mean is like they do a lot of multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary work. There's a lot of like sort of meta theoretical work that's about trying to define how knowledge is formed and created in the academy, and sort of channel out how different scholars pursue work in different kinds of ways. So it's not like a STEM journal or a humanities journal. It's a cross-disciplinary theory journal that's high impact. It's based in England, and we'll see what happens with that. I mean, we have a list of places we will explore, but I guess that's what I would say. Yeah, there's nothing like shady about not mentioning the specific journal. It's just because it is. I mean, we sent the proposal in 2 weeks ago. They sent it out for review a week ago. So it is like the proposal itself is currently under peer review, and
of course, okay, cool.
So I don't want your hordes of enthusiastic listeners to mob them and disrupt the Neutral
Right.
scholarly process.
Tens and tens of emails. So that would be different from an issue of Limina. Are you contributing to Limina at all, or
No, I mean,
in
I wrote
addition
the
to?
review of Ballander's book, which is kind of a long form review of it, and I get pings from my, you're a scholar, you have like different sort of uh, feeds that indicate when things you've written get when it looked at, etc. And so on the one hand, get more pings from the review of Ballander's book, probably because Ballander is like such a renowned guy. I mean, he has just an astonishing and stellar career that's just like kind of incomprehensibly terrifying for small fry like me. It's like, he was like he's like a legal theorist, and it's like a training judge and like all of these crazy places like Iraq and whatnot.
Whoa.
For like really serious stuff where he's like training judges to engage in international rights law for war criminals and things
Oh
like
my
this.
God.
It's just like completely out of my purview of experience, frankly. Like it's amazing. But so like the review for Limina has gotten more pings than like other work I've done elsewhere, even at decent journals, which is pretty normal. No one reads scholarship, including scholars mostly. So that's pretty normal. But I wrote that for Limina, and I don't have that much to do with them. I'll probably serve as a reviewer for stuff they do sometimes, but it is very much a society journal. And so the point of doing a special issue elsewhere is not to cast any aspersions on Limina. The work they do is great. They have excellent editors. It's a very rigorous and serious peer review process, but it is a society journal. And so I think just having been around the block a couple of times and seeing how things go and like how knowledge is formed and talked about formally and informally, society journals oftentimes, like, they are the special interest place where you go if you have this special interest as a scholar. And so their audience can be limited sometimes. It can explode sometimes because people are interested in the subject. They go there. It's like, holy cow, there's all this stuff. But I think a completely neutral, unaffiliated, high impact journal is a place where it's like, that's a thing that puts an emergent domain of knowledge formation on the map because it is not affiliated with the society that's trying to do something. It is like, no, this got through the review process at a place that has no attachment to this whatsoever and is like entirely neutral. And that's the whole point of the peer review process. So decided to try to push this forward, and we'll see what happens with that. I mean, I think there's a lot of things cooking. My sense, based on informal conversations, is there's a lot of, for academic spaces, there's a lot of things cooking of edited volumes here and there, and people are working on books and stuff like this. So I think, I would guess, not that you asked, but I would guess that in 2 or 3 years there will be sort of like, because the process can take a while for scholarly publication, but I would guess in 2 or 3 years there's going to be like a small explosion of monographs, which is like books on the subject, edited volumes from university presses, and publications from journals that otherwise have nothing to do with the subject, particularly that scholars from different disciplines and institutions have pushed through advance through the peer review process, which can take usually years.
Well, that actually is what I was going to ask next is what are you hoping to see in the next few years of UAP studies? How should the field evolve? What should people keep in mind? What kind of frameworks or parameters would you like to see grow?
Well,
what kind of work interests you?
All of the scholarly literature is great. I mean, to go all the way back to the start of the conversation, I was working on a semi-creative and semi-scholarly project about 10 years ago to do with what's sometimes called psychogeography, which is not really a scholarly discipline. It's sort of like an artistic, literary, experimental discipline that has a lot to do with the relationship between landscapes of places and psychological intensities and productions and literary productions and things like this. It's pretty siloed to it's like a very British kind of thing, and it's kind of an unusual kind of thing. It's like, I don't know if you know Alan Moore.
Yes.
Alan Moore is like intensely psychogeographical writer. Ian Sinclair, other people like this. They're mostly British. They're very interested in like relationships between London and like the geographical and archaeological density of London, and various kinds of creative and artistic expressions and explorations to do with everything from comic books and poems and novels and things like this. And I really like those guys and engaged with their work and find it very stimulating. And I was curious. This story is going somewhere, bear with me, why there isn't like an American psychogeography scene. Because of course, like, you look as an intellectual historian, you look at the American landscape is like, whether it's the open frontier and all of the problematic stuff that comes along with Manifest Destiny and the rest of it, or like the fundamental strangeness of the fact that we're really a pretty new country, mostly composed of like non-indigenes, like non-indigenous populations. It's like there's a lot of sort of psychogeographical strangeness and interest here. And so I was thinking about a little book that would be a non-scholarly book, but like a more creative kind of book touching on this topic of American psychogeography. And I was, putting together elements of this, just thinking about what chapters would be in it and what would they do. And so it's about 10 years ago. And one of the chapters is I was like, well, one of the chapters has got to be called UFO Land, because you have like these imaginaries and images and sort of creative stuff and strange stuff about like whatever, the hills driving in their car and the middle of the night in the Catskills or whatever, and being abducted, and like these sort of images of like people in rural locations seeing lights in the sky and all these kinds of things. And so I was curious at that time, was like, well, okay, like I am a scholar with some scholarly background, so what's the scholarly literature on this? Like, what's the scholarly literature on the UFO thing? Not even from the perspective of thinking about UFOs, but just like as a cultural history. And there was just not a lot. And I was surprised by that at the time. It was like, well, that's weird. Like, I mean, there was a book by Thomas Bullard. I think this is before Pasulka's book that I think a lot of people read and were struck by. You had ufological literatures and you had some things here and there, but for the most part, the cultural history of the UFO object, even just as a discourse object or a mythic referent, it was very sparse. So that struck me at the time. And as a long-winded answer to your question, it's like, it's interesting and exciting to see an emergent literature that takes something that like everyone, quote unquote, knows what it is. Everyone knows what the point of reference is. I mean, you could go outside of your house and throw a rock and you hit someone with that rock. And before you go to prison for throwing rocks, you ask them like, what's a UFO and what's an alien? And they're going to be able to say stuff, whether it's about Spock or Greys or the X-Files or lights in the sky or flying saucers or whatever. Like, everyone sort of already knows what an alien is. Everyone sort of knows what a UFO is. It is latent in the space and distributed throughout it, but it's often been understudied or like not studied in a careful and systematic way. So I'm excited to see like literatures and scholars from a really wide range of disciplines engage and touch on this material. And I think it's still very nascent or new, and there's a lot of work to be done here, even just from a historical and theoretical and conceptual perspective. And so the actual answer to your question is something like, well, I want to see some movement in the just non-scholarly space, actually. I mean, as a person who is very agnostic and kind of removed from a lot of the sort of excitement in the space or whatever, like, one would like to see something, so some kind of determinacy outside of just scholarly engagement or creative engagement or private engagement is what one would like to see. But that's kind of an open question, I guess, or not one you can just snap your fingers and make it happen.
It's an ongoing conversation. And as you say, it's still at a relatively early phase. So you're getting in at a pretty good time. This is a good couple of years for Theory of the Alien.
It's quite disorientating, because I think maybe some of your other guests have made this observation as like, one didn't really expect to be here and is slightly disorientated that one is here.
Yeah.
But if you're actually, I don't know, trying to formulate a research question that's of interest and then pursue it kind of doggedly, one sometimes finds oneself in a strange kind of space.
Yeah, it's inherently interesting, the frontier, right? It's rugged,
Right.
There's unknown landscape, and you're carving the roads into the mountains yourself. So it's potentially very fruitful, but it can be lonely, it can be a little scary, and it's inherently adventurous.
Yeah, I think so.
So I look forward to seeing more of your academic work, but I'm also really excited to see more of your creative work. And would you like to just mention the fiction that you've written as a place that people could reach out and engage? Because I know you're not very active online. I don't know if you'd like to share a social handle or something, but
I'm on Blue Sky.
Okay.
I was on Twitter for a while, and then it used to be good, like all the bands or whatever. They used to be good, and then they got lame, and then you leave them or whatever. But yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. I think easily searchable under my name, and I mainly at the current moment use it to like cross-link essays and things, because I do a lot of popular interpretive essays on mostly like horror and science fiction media. This kind of thing is like a pretty strong background and set of interests, and the history of horror and adventure literatures of various kinds. So I engage with that space both fictionally and then sort of in a popular nonfiction kind of way. I often think that, adventure and horror literatures have kind of interesting philosophical or conceptual things going on in them. And so I try to elucidate that in some of the more popular writing, which I've been doing more of and less of what I should be doing, which is like the good scholarly work, which I'm supposed to be doing mostly for the money and the immense amount of money that instantly comes in when you do scholarly work. I'm being sarcastic if that's not evident.
Well, keep a foot in both ponds.
Yeah.
And people can find your work. Is Blue Sky the best place for them to engage?
Blue Sky, or just my website is just my name.com, michaeluhall.com, and I keep like a CV and a list of publications there, basically. It's pretty skeletal at the moment, but yeah, I don't have a lot of social media presence or whatever.
That's probably better.
michaeluhall.com. That's where I do work and I report on work that I'm doing of various kinds. I mean, I'm probably about to be less present for like a year or two because I actually need to write the book. The Alien book is under contract with I think Routledge is like, I don't know, intimidatingly prominent in scholarly spaces. It's like the largest scholarly publisher in the world, I think, at this point. And so
you got to finish it up.
I guess I should do that.
Otherwise, they're going to send them back to your house.
Yeah, you write a proposal as an academic, and it's promissory, but you haven't done the work yet, and then you have to do the work. But oftentimes, the work changes, or your relation to the work changes in the process of doing it. That's just part of the normal process here. So we'll see what happens, but hopefully, I will just be able to write it, and then it will be good. Or at least done.
Well, we're excited that you're out there carving passages in the great adventurous beyond for us all to follow and read and learn from. And I'm really grateful for you taking the time here. I know we stepped a little out of your comfort zone to do something public here. And I think it was a really interesting conversation. I hope people enjoy it. And I hope they come check out your work because it sounds like you're doing really interesting stuff, both academically and creatively. So michaeluhall.com. And Michael Uhall on Blue Sky. And thank you again for speaking with us today so much, Michael. It was great to meet you, man.
Yeah, thanks very much.
And that's the show. Thank you for watching or listening. Please support us on patreon.com/WTUFO, patreon.com/WTUFO. That will increase the odds that the show continues to exist. If you're listening in a podcast format, you can also rate and review us on your podcast player of choice. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can like and subscribe. It also never hurts to tell a friend about us or pop us in a social feed. Maybe if you have a favorite episode, you could share it on a thread somewhere. Thank you again for watching, listening, enjoying, and supporting. And I hope you're all having a great day.